Hi everyone, welcome in. Hello. I think we're going to have a couple more people trickling in, so I'll just give it another minute before we get started. Yeah, it'd be great if you introduced yourselves in the chat in the meantime. I hope you're comfortable and have a nice beverage because we've got a great session for you today. Let's just wait one more minute. Welcome if you're just joining. Okay, I will go ahead and get us started. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us today, and welcome to our webinar on understanding Textile Exchange's Cotton LCA study. I'm Deborah Gore, and I'm the Cotton and Crops lead here at Textile Exchange. If we go to the next slide, we'll just kick off with a bit of housekeeping before I hand over to the impact measurement team to officially kick things off. But before we start, I'd just like to remind you of our antitrust statement that Textile Exchange convenes the textile community and values a diversity of views, expertise, backgrounds, but it is expected that members of this community will collaborate by sharing ideas, information, and resources of publicly available information only, and avoid discussions on price, strategic plans, or other private and sensitive information. Additionally, as with many of our sessions, we're going to be operating today under the Chatham House rule. So you're welcome to use information that is shared today, but please do not reveal the identity or affiliation of any particular speaker or anyone else here. So I'll now take you through our agenda for today and what to expect. We're going to begin with an overview of Textile Exchange's position on LCAs before then moving to the key deliverables and findings from this report. From there, we'll then walk through a summary of the results, particularly taking a closer look at cotton cultivation results and the recycled cotton results. We'll then introduce our LCA Plus approach and assessment, and talk about how that kind of adds value beyond traditional LCA methodologies. We'll then cover the timeline and available resources and what comes next after the release of this LCA. And then at the end, we should have time for Q&A. So please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box down below, not the chat box, the Q&A box. And we will get to those in the Q&A segment. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Firstly, I'm joined by a panel of my Textile Exchange colleagues. We have our Chief Impact Officer, Beth Jensen, joining us, Francesca Sartor, our Impact Data Manager, and Felicity Clark, our Impact Measurement Manager. We're also joined today by two external speakers who we partnered with for this LCA study. We have Daniel Tillman, a freelance sustainability consultant and agricultural LCA expert, and Iris Matska, who is a senior manager of consulting at Sfera. And with that, I'm now going to hand over to Beth to get us started. So over to you, Beth.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Great to see such a great group of people interested in our cotton LCA. It looks like there are a few questions about the audio, so it might just be isolated, I think. So hopefully we'll carry on. Um, but the first thing I just wanted to introduce, in case you haven't seen it yet, is what I would say all of our life cycle assessment studies that we're doing is grounded in. And it's really this paper that we released last year called Ensuring Integrity in the Use of Life Cycle Assessment Data. And it basically really lays out how life cycle assessment data in general should be used and should not be used. And it's really intended for anybody who's looking to develop a greater understanding of how to use this type of data for the purposes that we have here in the textile and fashion and apparel industry. So, this is really part of our commitment to convening actors across the supply chain to improve the impact data that's available for the industry. This is really a foundational component of this, and all of our thinking today and everything we're sharing today is really grounded in this paper. So a few points, if you want to move to the next slide, a few points that we cover in this paper related to how life cycle assessment data should be used. Really, life cycle assessment data should really only be used when there's a clear understanding of all of the underlying methodologies, assumptions, intended use of the data and how it's been put forward. Really, you should be avoiding comparing LCA data between different fiber or material categories, particularly between natural and synthetic material categories, because those are two very different approaches within LCA methodology. So they're not comparable. Really, we should always be avoiding comparing LCA data between separate LCA studies, even within the same category, or even within a study. The caveat to that is unless it is specifically designed as a comparative LCA study. But unless you know that for sure, you really should be avoiding comparing LCA data between studies or even within a study. You should also avoid comparing LCA data between different industry databases because all of the different methodologies and assumptions likely vary across those different databases. And finally, Textile Exchange really advocates for consideration of adopting what we call an LCA plus approach. So that's really acknowledging the fact that life cycle assessment data is one really good input to understanding impact of raw materials and fibers and those production systems. And it's not it should not be used as the only input. Like we know it doesn't cover everything. There are other impact areas such as biodiversity, soil health, animal welfare, and livelihoods that aren't covered by traditional LCA methodology. And so we as Textile Exchange, for a number of years now, have talked about the need to take an LCA plus approach, which is saying, yes, let's use LCA data, but also let's look for other data sources to inform a truly holistic view of impact. So next slide. The goal and intended use really of Textile Exchange's LCA data, we just wanted to cover off on this quickly. And really all the LCA studies that we're putting out. Really the data should be used for, looking at robust LCA data sets like what you might find in some of the industry databases that are used. We also believe it can really be helpful in supporting brands and other organizations in their Scope 3 reporting, supporting scenario modeling and strategy development, data for internal benchmarking and validation, informing future improvements. This is a really important one. So, to what end are we collecting this data and putting it out in the world? Really, ultimately, it's to identify where we can take action to inform beneficial impact in these production systems. And then identifying major hotspot impact areas. This is kind of along those same veins, really identifying kind of where the priority areas are for focus in terms of action. Um, and also, I guess I should say the other point related to future improvements and updates is really related to the data sets themselves. So not only improvements within the supply chain and kind of within the production system you're looking at, but also identifying where we still might have data gaps and where future LCA or other impact data work can help address those data gaps. And this data should not be used for any sort of public claims, marketing claims. You have some sort of examples here of any of those forms of comparison that should be avoided. It should not be used for production or sourcing decision making based solely on country average LCA results. So again, this should be one input into decision making, not the only input. And really, LCA should not be used as the unique source of truth, particularly when primary data is available from suppliers. So as always, we recommend, if you have the ability to get, if you're a brand and you have the ability, to utilize data that's specific to your supplier and supply system, that's always the ideal case. But what we're, as Textile Exchange, what we're providing here is country average data that we hope can help fill some of those data gaps that we know exist for brands and other organizations in their modeling and so forth. And lastly, just to cover off on our LCA study program at Textile Exchange. So this cotton LCA study is the first of 7 that we're conducting currently. You can see them listed here: cashmere, responsible wool standard wool, responsible mohair standard mohair, leather hides, cotton, which we'll cover today, polyester, and nylon. And this program of work was really started in sort of 2022 with the cotton LCA beginning in 2023. And these are very significant pieces of work, multi-year projects. The data collection takes a tremendous amount of time and energy, and we're really proud to be launching the first of these 7 LCA studies today. So with that, deliverables and key findings, I'll hand over to Francesca.
Thank you, Beth. Okay. So today we are really pleased to announce that the results of our cotton LCA study, along with all the related resources, are now publicly available on our website. So all LCA study deliverables will be fully aligned with our position as outlined in the paper Integrity in the Use of LCA, as presented by Beth in the previous slides. But specifically for the cotton LCA, to ensure that industry can easily assess and use all the results, we provide a range of supporting resources, including the technical LCA report, so a full LCA ISO compliant report, including all the details such as scope, boundaries, assumptions, modeling approach, results, and limitation. Then a summary report, which is a shorter version of the full LCA that presents the key finding and results in a less technical way. An LCA FAQs to provide responses to key questions about the LCA study to help improve the interpretation and understanding of the findings and results. And also a model comparison report, which presents the results of a parallel project held to understand the outputs of different LCA model providers using the same input data. The goal was to better understand variation in results and to support further alignment in modeling approaches across the cotton LCA community. All data sets will also be submitted to various industry databases such as EcoInvent, Sphere, WorldDB, and HigMSI. Okay. So we'll deep dive into the results in a second with our consultants, but let's just take a moment to reflect on which are the key findings from the study. So this study represents a considerable advancement in the quality of LCA data for cotton, although some limitations remain, specifically, especially regarding data viability, representativeness, and methodology. To better understand long-term and localized environmental impacts and benefits, more detailed site-specific assessment at farm or regional level are needed, along with stronger data collection partnership with cotton organizations and on-the-ground stakeholders. Given the non-comparative nature of the study, the variation in results across regions, and differences in data quality, no generic comparative statement can be made. Instead, there are different ways to reduce impacts, and it is more effective to focus on concrete management practices and interventions rather than on broad product system classifications like organic versus regenerative. We also wanted to take a moment to reflect on some of the key learnings that we got from this study, from this LCA study, but also more broadly from our LCA work. So what we learned from these projects is that data collection is never one size fits all. It requires the right support, capacity, and must be adapted to different production systems. We also face recurring challenges, such as obtaining representative data for certain regions or certain production systems. Strong relationship with stakeholders are essentials, especially when working with Tier 4 actors. The value proposition of the project needs to be clear and relevant to them from the start. Taking an holistic approach is critical, so LCA results should consider the broader context of the production system. At the same time, we saw that LCA plus impact data viability is still quite limited. And then these projects are both time and resource intensive, so with the data collection and critical review being the most demanding phases. We also learned that collective action is powerful, so collaborative LCAs create shared value and help move the entire industry forward. Finally, communication matters, so timely, transparent engagement with the project group, especially through in-person meeting, made a real difference. And importantly, results must always be presented carefully, ensuring they are neutral and do not appear to favor or disadvantage any specific production system or region. And with this, I will pass it over to Daniel so he can start presenting some results. Over to you, Daniel.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Francesca. So yeah, I'll start to talk about some real content now for our real results. Although the section has the headline results, I wanted to start a little bit picking up on what Francesca already mentioned about data collection, because data collection or our experience with data collection can also be considered part of the results of the study, because we really try to assess how we're aware that there are different initiatives on data collection ongoing, and we really try to assess to what extent these efforts could be leveraged to create such an assessment as we're conducting for this LCA, with mixed results. But as Francesca already said, the data collection and the learnings about data collection is really one part of the results of this study. When you look at this slide, you see that we consider different cultivation systems. First, for cotton cultivation, country average or a reference system, organic and regenerative, and then for recycled cotton, post-industrial yarn waste, post-industrial fabric waste, and post-consumer waste. And we also looked at different geographies. Basically, we were looking into regions with relevant production, but also, as Francesca has already explained, it's really important to obtain, in order to obtain high quality data, to have a good relationship to data providers or some outreach to data providers in the region. So the mix that you see here is a mix of relevant production regions, but also regions where we had good starting points for data collection. Also to mention that we're aware that it's not always easy to define these production systems, and that there is more in the report, the discussion on how exactly these production systems are differentiated and defined. Last point on this slide is to say that we also use different data collection approaches. So we had a clear focus on trying to obtain primary data, but also developed approaches to use secondary data where there were data gaps that we needed to fill. If you can go to the next slide. I also want to highlight how important the critical review process was in this study. The critical review really shaped the study, helped to ensure that we had good data quality, and shaped how we are interpreting and displaying results, and the communication piece. So we are really grateful for the support and the effort the critical review panel put into this. We had Jesse from Cotton Incorporated, Alan from CRDC Australia, Miguel from Better Cotton Initiative, and Joel from Cascale. And yeah, in total, they provided over 400 review comments, and we had to go through 3 rounds of review. It was a lot of effort, but it was definitely worth it. And in addition, we had also a less formal, but also very valuable support from a technical advisory group where we had local experts or experts for specific production systems also providing feedback. And yeah, the result is a long report, 289 pages, with a lot of nuance and a lot of context. And yeah, I really encourage you to have a look into it, because in this webinar we can really only scratch the surface, and the good work and the good details are in the report. If you can go to the next slide, next one. Just as also important context for the results, to mention that the system boundaries, these are probably not new to anyone who already looked into studies or into this field. Just as a summary, to say that this is a cradle to gate study, so that we looked at all the relevant inputs into the cotton cultivation system, and then also included the ginning step, where the fiber is separated from the seeds, and where it's also worth to mention that at this point we need to allocate the environmental burden from the cultivation to the fiber and to the seeds, and where we took an economic allocation approach to allocate the impacts between these two products. If you can go to the next slide. So this is the first, or the main result graph that we wanted to show. And this might be a surprise for you, because you might have expected that we'll show this bar chart with the absolute numbers between from the different cultivation system. But as part of what Beth and Francesca have already outlined, we're really aware, we're really conscious about not pushing comparisons too much. There are absolute numbers in the report. There's also a lot of ranges and if and whens in the report. But we really wanted to also show, as Francesca said, that the production systems have their own hotspots, and specific cultivation practices lead to specific impacts. And this is what we wanted to show here with the graph. Hotspots in the different cultivation systems, where we see clearly the contribution from field emissions, which is related to the nitrogen input. We also see the impact from fertilizer production, especially in the country average reference systems. And we also see the impacts from irrigation in those systems where irrigation is applied. The irrigation energy is, but we also have a system such as Peru, where irrigation is applied, but it's mainly gravity irrigation. So although there is irrigation, we'll not see a contribution to climate change. I also want to highlight here that for each graph and table in the report, we're adding context in form of a data quality level. So we're not just reporting results, but we wanted to highlight that the data quality, the underlying data quality, is different for different data sets. We have done a full data quality rating according to, or in close alignment with the PEF methodology, but since this is quite technical and a bit difficult to understand, we have summarized or simplified it into an easy scoring system, where 1 is good data quality, 2 is medium data quality, and 3 is limited, so that you can already see that where data sets are where you need to be particularly careful with the interpretation. If you go to the next slide, please, Francesca. Another reason why we're careful to show the absolute values is that we found that the results depend a lot on assumptions and methodological approaches, and we put a lot of effort in this study to understand how these assumptions and approaches shape the results, and how they influence and lead to ranges rather than absolute values. One aspect, just to take to explain one concrete example, is that you saw the contribution of mineral fertilizer provision in the contribution analysis. in systems that use organic fertilizer, the default assumption is that the organic fertilizer is entering the system burden-free. So it's basically considered a waste product from the animal cultivation system. So you will not see provision impacts from the organic fertilizer, but this assumption can be challenged, or you can also take another assumption. And then, of course, if you allocate some burden to the provision of organic fertilizer, you'll also find that there is higher impacts for those systems that use the organic fertilizer. So you just see that this is one of these scenarios where you can say the results can be higher or lower depending on the methodological approach. And in a similar way, we looked on emission factors specific to climate zones provided in the IPCC guidelines. We looked at the uncertainty of nutrient content in organic fertilizer. We looked at different ways to assess the nitrogen balance and to account for deficits in applied nitrogen in the fertilizer inventories. We looked at ecotoxicity characterization factors and their impact on the ecotoxicity results. We compared primary and secondary data collection approach for these regions where this was possible, so that we got a sense on how robust the secondary data is where we had to use it, and looked at renewable energy use at the gin, how this is could potentially reduce the impacts. So yeah, there is a lot of this in the report with the impact on results, and again, the encouragement to look into the final report and to have a closer look on this. If you can go to the next slide. So to summarize some of the findings specific to the cotton cultivation, what we really saw is that there are some like systematic drivers that influence or shape the results for the different cultivation system. And I think something that can be highlighted is the type of fertilizer that is used in the cultivation systems, but also the amount of fertilizer or the amount of nitrogen that is applied. And if you have a nitrogen surplus, this translates into climate change impact, but also into eutrophication and acidification impacts. And we already discussed also the different provision impacts of the fertilizer used. Irrigation, I already explained that it's a relevant environmental impact because irrigation can contribute to water scarcity, but at the same time, there's also an related energy use, and this energy use then is translated into impact on climate change. So efficiency improvements here will have a double benefit, so to say. For pesticides, we saw that they, of course, shape the ecotoxicity results, but there's also a lot of uncertainty and care that needs to be taken if you look at the toxicity characterization factors for the pesticides. Also, we see that yields shape the results because impacts are often, some impacts are really related to an per area impact, and then if you have a higher yield from an area, some of these per area impacts are scaled down. And to repeat, last but not least, the scenario analysis really showed that the results remain sensitive to some methodological choices. So this was the part on cotton cultivation. And with this, I hand over to Iris, who will talk about the recycled cotton part.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, colleagues from Textile Exchange for the introduction. Welcome also from my side. So let's talk about recycled. If you could shift to this next slide. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's have a look at the system boundaries at first. I'll take a moment to talk about this in a bit more detail because what we actually can see in this slide is system boundaries for 3 different waste types that we were looking at. Daniel had already explained that we had those 3 different waste types. So the first waste type is post-industrial yarn waste, second one post-industrial fabric waste, and also at post-consumer waste. And the 3 different waste type system boundaries are differentiated between with the dotted lines that you can see in the diagram. So if we take the smallest square now at the right bottom corner, we look at post-industrial yarn waste, and post-industrial yarn waste only takes very few processes for the recycling process. Basically, it only needs a fiber opening process for which electricity and also potentially lubricants are involved until we receive our result that we would like to have, which is the recycled spinnable fiber. As byproducts for the recycling processes, we always also get a little bit of fluff, and we also get filling and dust materials. So if we now extend the system boundary a little bit more to represent the post-industrial fabric waste, we have an additional recycling step involved, which is the cutting step. This cutting step might potentially involve some electricity use. Then we have the fiber opening, and then we get the fibers. And if we now look at the full picture, at this whole diagram, this is basically representative for the system boundaries of post-consumer waste. It is the largest system boundary because the recycling of post-consumer waste requires a few more processing steps. In the beginning, what you can see on the very left side is a fumigation step. This fumigation step is basically a disinfection step or a sterilization step after the collection of post-consumer waste, but it is not always carried out because it is not always required. I'll get to that in a bit more detail in a second. So we decided to exclude the fumigation step from our base scenario, but look at it in one of the scenario analyses that we calculated. So the system boundaries for the post-consumer waste actually start at a sorting process, with a sorting process for which we can use electricity, followed by removal of trims, zippers, buttons, and so on, which can also require electricity. Then it's cutted and fibers are opened. So these are the system boundaries that we use for calculating the results for recycled cotton. And if we now go to the next slide, we can have a very short glimpse on the results that we saw. Since Daniel already explained the way how we display those results, I don't need to say many words about this. What you can see here is results for climate change in relative contributions. That means we have a contribution analysis, which gives us the opportunity to detect the most important drivers of the processes for the environmental impacts for the results. So if we now walk through this diagram, we see 4 different bars, not 3, and I'll just walk you through this now. So on the very left side, you can see the results for post-industrial yarn waste, and then we have the post-industrial fabric waste. The 2 bars on the right side both represent results for post-consumer waste, but we have a differentiation here. We have a differentiation between domestic post-consumer waste, which is waste that is collected, sorted, and then processed in the same country. And we also considered a post-consumer waste with an international transportation scenario, because sometimes it is also the case that post-consumer waste is collected and then transported very far distances over country borders or even over continents. So we found this very important, and that's why we split it up, the post-consumer waste results, into these 2 different scenarios that we looked at. And what you can see for the 3 bars on the left is that they basically look a bit similar. When you look at the most important contributors to the results, you can see light green and grayish brownish color, which is both electricity. So electricity is the most important factor for climate change results in the recycling process. What we can also see is at the top, this dark bluish color, which is transportation. So transportation also matters to a smaller percentage, but also roughly we see 10 to 15% contribution from transportation as well. You see a very small yellow line here as well, which is standing for packaging, auxiliaries, and end of life of processing waste. And the results for the post-consumer waste, including the international transportation, now look a bit different, because logically, if you have longer transportation distances, this also reflects in the results. So the dark blue colors that we have at the top of the bar represent the international transportation, which includes additional truck transportation and also ship transportation. And you can see that this has a very high contribution to the final results. Now, as Daniel also has mentioned already, there are a lot of assumptions that we have taken, and there are also a lot of variables that can influence the results. And we now tried to pick out the most interesting and most important variables to see what influence we get if we create scenarios varying those variables. So if we go to the next slide. This is an overview on the scenario and the sensitivity analysis that we carried out. Since we saw that electricity plays such a major role, we looked in detail at the electricity data sets that we used and changed the average data sets that we used to country-specific regionalized data sets to see which variations we can get here. Also, energy generation was something that we investigated. What happens if we change to solar completely, or what happens if we change to coal completely? Then what I already mentioned was the international shipping scenario, in which we included different transportation distances, representing different scenarios that we have. And also sometimes we have a washing and drying step of post-consumer waste of clothes that are collected that is carried out by a recycler, but not everybody does that. So we have included it in a scenario analysis as well, playing around with electricity values, with detergents, and so on. And the same is also true for the fumigation step that I had already mentioned in the beginning. Fumigation is something that not always takes place, but sometimes. And there it's possible to use a fumigant, which is a chemical substance, biocide or something, in different identities. So in the base scenario, we used phosphine, for example, but there can also be other substances that can be used. So we looked at the influence of other substances at different concentrations and so on. And as an additional sensitivity analysis, we also carried out an economic allocation of the byproducts, which are fluff and dust, which I've already mentioned in the beginning. So I also invite you to have a closer look at those scenarios because they are really interesting and can be found in the technical report. And if we now go to the key findings on the last slide, some of the things I have mentioned already. So electricity and transportation are significant contributors to the results of recycled cotton fibers. For post-consumer waste, when you have a look at the results in the technical report and also at the absolute results, you can see that there are differences between the different waste types. For post-consumer waste, for example, we have some additional processing steps that are required to fiber opening, which I showed in the first slide, and we have higher process waste losses. Therefore, we have a higher electricity consumption, which also shows in the results. The scenario analysis showed that international transportation plays a very important role, but also washing and drying and also fumigation can all influence the results. We have always to keep in mind that whenever we look at the results, we still have a high uncertainty remaining regarding the potential environmental impacts of the individual suppliers of recycled cotton fibers. So we cannot automatically assume that one type is inherently more impactful than another. So we should always keep that in mind. So much for recycling, and I'll hand over to Felicity.
Thanks, Iris. So I'm going to run us through our LCA assessment slides. So for each of our LCAs, we've considered the relevant LCA plus areas, impact areas. This is because impact areas considered within current LCAs are limited, focusing on only a subset of environmental impacts. Textile Exchange has developed an LCA plus approach to take a more holistic view to complement the LCA data by including impact areas such as biodiversity, soil health, animal welfare, and social livelihoods. These are not covered within current LCA methodology due to the complex nature of these impact areas, and also because it's not always possible to quantitatively measure these impacts. So Textile Exchange believes it's important to include even qualitative assessments where possible. For cotton, in the case of the cotton LCA, we've included qualitative assessments for soil health, social impact, and biodiversity. And then the next section on timeline and other resources for the project. So in addition to the learnings we've shared in this presentation, we also wanted to give you a sense of the overall project timeline. This really shows the resource and effort that has gone into this project. As Beth mentioned, the Cotton LCA project began in 2023 and has taken nearly 3 years to complete. We found that the data collection and critical review phases proved to be the most time-intensive parts, both spanning more than 6 months. The publication of the report took place at the end of March, just a couple of weeks ago, and can now be accessed through our website. Next slide. So where are we now? The report has been released, as you're all aware, and alongside this, we also released the cotton modelling comparison report, which evaluates how methodological differences in modelling approaches can influence the impact profiles for cotton. It's a really interesting read and highly relevant to our LCA results. As you're aware, we are hosting the external Cotton LCR webinar today. And then the final step in this project is the results becoming available on the databases. We're expecting this to happen for the databases listed here, so the HIG MSI, Qantas WorldDB, and EcoInvent by the end of this year. The first of these databases will be the HIG MSI, which we expect to happen in the next round of updates in the next month or so. So please keep an eye out for that. And with that, I'll hand over to Beth.
Yes, and just a final thought on next steps, and then we can move to Q&A. You can move to the next slide. Yeah, so this is really just a call to all of you just to say that we're happy to explore additional pieces of work related to this cotton LCA study. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Of course, as we mentioned, we have our other life cycle assessment studies that will be forthcoming. Polyester and cashmere are two that are coming up next. But related to the cotton study specifically, yeah, happy to hear from you on any sort of next steps that you might like to see. And you can see the email address here that you can contact to share any ideas you may have. So with that, I think we'll move to question and answer. And again, please, a reminder to put any questions that you have specifically into the Q&A box, not into the chat box. The Q&A box is where we are collating all of your questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Beth. Yeah, we do have some time for Q&A now. I'll start with the questions that we've received in the Q&A box, but if there are any other questions that come to mind, please do feel free to keep putting them in there. We did receive a couple of questions about comparisons, but Daniel did touch on that. So I think if that's okay with you, I will come back to those if we have time at the end. Just looking at the questions. Maybe Beth, in terms of next steps, we did receive some questions about maintenance plans for the data sets or plans to update them, and if we have a regular cadence in mind for that. Do you want to take that one?
Sure. And the short answer is not yet. We just launched this one after 3 years of work. So we need to take a breath for a minute. But we're open to chatting with the industry about needs and what they would like to see, following on to this study, whether that's, additional data or refresh of the existing data that we have in here, or there are a number of different pieces of work that are also related, but not necessarily a new study per se. There's lots more that we could dig into related to the LCA plus areas, for example, on soil health or those types of topics. So anyway, again, we're happy to hear from the community on what you feel like is needed.
Great, thank you. We then received a few questions about countries covered in the LCAs. So I'm going to group them together. And perhaps Daniel or Francesca, if you want to take these. We received a question about the African countries covered. Also, just clarifying that cotton from Xinjiang, China is not part of the scope. And lastly, a question about the Peru organic and regenerative results and how they can be exactly the same in the percentage distribution.
Okay, Africa,
Go
we
ahead,
have
Alex.
we have organic cotton from Tanzania in there. And yeah, you might be aware that Cotton Made in Africa is working on parallel studies at the same time. So since they are like, I would say, there is a good partnership between Textile Exchange and their LCA work and our LCA work. We also didn't want to create overlaps there. Yeah, but I mean, there are many countries that you can ask, like Australia or Pakistan, or why are they not in there? And as we said, we had to start with something, and part of this phase 2 or ideas for follow-up work could be to include more countries now that we have some sort of like a methodology established and some good experience. I think that could be something that could be considered for future updates or a phase 2.
Can I just jump in on that very
Yeah,
quickly?
sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, just to say, ability to get data, country level data requires data providers to be willing to provide that data. And one of the biggest challenges that we faced in all of our LCA studies um, is just being able to get the data from different countries. We would have included any number of other countries if we were able to get that data in a timely fashion. And it's not there are multiple reasons for this. Let me say it's not because data providers don't want to provide it. It's capacity challenges. For data providers, a value is that, they're essentially getting their data back. So they're essentially, getting a life cycle assessment study done for them as part of this project. So there is a good value proposition there for them as well. But we recognize too, it's a lift. It does take time and energy. And for that reason and for some other reasons, we did have challenges getting data from some other countries that we would have liked to get data from. Or perhaps it's the case where we had, maybe 1 or 2 supplier groups that were able to provide data, but it wasn't enough for a representative sample, so to speak. So anyway, just to be aware, that's one major challenge with all of these LCA studies, is just being able to get the data, and work together with providers to do that. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah, for Peru, organic and regenerative, this is a good catch. It's related to how the regenerative systems are defined and considered in our study. I mean, many of these regenerative systems are in a pilot stage or just like building up over the last couple of years. And we found that it was not always easy to like have a very, how do you say, strict definition of what's regenerative or not. So basically, we found that there are 2 directions for regenerative system. One is that is basically organic, and another one that is improved conventional, reduced fertilizer, reduced pesticide use. And both of these can be classified as regenerative. In the case of Peru, there is a significant producer there that shared with us both the organic and the regenerative data, and the systems are pretty much very close to each other. So they could be also classified as organic and regenerative, but it was data from the same data provider and basically referring to a very similar production system that was basically following organic principles. And the last one on China, maybe Francesca or Beth or anyone from Textile Exchange, if you want to take that one.
Go ahead, Francesca.
Yeah, apologies. Changed the slide rather than unmute myself. So for China specifically, we made a decision as an organization to just include some selected regions. So the regions that are included within the study are called out in the full study. I realized that there was an asterisk in the slide, but there was no information there. But more details can be provided, can be found in the full report and also in the summary, if I'm not wrong.
Thank you. Francesca, we'll stay with you. We received a question about, or two questions actually, relating to availability of our LCA data in other databases. One about the timeline for availability of data in MolDB, Sphera, and EcoInvent. Regarding HIG MSI, is May 2026 a timeline for availability of the data set, or is it the timeline for starting the integration process? And also a question about the PEF database as well.
Yeah, okay. So for the HIG-MSI specifically, May 2026, beginning of May 2026 is the time when the data will be available in the HIG-MSI. So as you might know already, there are two releases that HIG-MSI has during the year. So they have a May 1, April, May 1, and one in October. So the cotton data will be included in the May release. But the approach is slightly different for the other databases, which don't have this fixed release dates, but they update the database more on a case-by-case basis. So we don't have yet an exact date for when the data will be available on the other databases, such as Sphera, MolDB, and EcoInvent, but 99% they will be available by the end of this year and also like in Q3, hopefully. And in terms of PEF, we are monitoring the what is happening with the PEF, and we are also like monitoring how we could contribute to the PEF database with our data. So we are in conversation with that as well with other databases. So yeah, we are open to the opportunity, but there's nothing like defined yet there, because as you might know, there are a lot of updates and like it's an evolving process, also the submission process and so on. So yeah. So there is not a plan yet, but we are open for that.
Wonderful, thank you. We received a question about the LCA Plus approach that was presented from Alejandra. Could you explain which type of qualitative studies you did regarding social biodiversity and soil damage, soil health, or provide a couple of examples, perhaps? I think that'd be great for Daniel and Iris to share more, because that was quite lightly covered in today's webinar, but a lot more that we could say.
Yeah. As Francesca has put it in the beginning, it was not easy because this is like, I would say, there's not a like very clear standard approach that you could just follow through and just tick boxes and do it. So you had to explore also what's possible and to what extent you could consider these aspects alongside an LCA study. I think in terms of soil, to summarize it, we were basically looking at soil carbon as an, let's say, indicator for soil health, and on different management practices that could potentially increase soil carbon. And then we even did a quantitative assessment on how change from one practice to another could increase the soil carbon content under specific conditions. We're following the IPCC approach and the IPCC guidelines. So there, I think we have some interesting results, but of course these are indicators, and because those of you who work with soil and soil carbon know that the impacts are very site specific, and there is a lot of detailed data necessary to make very robust assessments. So this is why we had to work with more like directional results in here. And for biodiversity, we were basically looking at different literature studies and try to summarize important points in relation to cotton cultivation and how they relate to the impacts that we were assessing. And where we can assume that there is a direct correlation, or where the correlation might also be limited, or where we have to be careful to assume direct correlations. So there the assessment is really more qualitative. And for the social, I would like to hand over to Iris, because she was leading this part, so that she can
Yes.
summarize real quick.
Thanks, Daniel. Yes, I mean, for social, of course, social aspects could be a study in itself. However, we were limited in time and wanted to include this in the LCA Plus approach. And what we did here was actually we had different approaches. So we used UNED for recommendations on which social impact categories we should focus in the context that we were looking at. And yeah, we had a variety of different information sources of information then that we included in the report. We developed questionnaires that we sent out to the data providers with a question catalog on different aspects of human rights or social issues. Then we had interviews with social experts from the sector, also reflecting on the answers that we received from those questionnaires, but also getting their opinions on several topics. We did some literature research, and all those information went together in the part of the social impacts or the human rights assessment in the report. Yes.
Thank you. While we have you, Iris, there's I think a quick question for you. Did post-consumer waste include cotton-only fabrics or mixed material fabrics?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so we focused on cotton fabrics in this study, but it's a great question. Could be something for a follow-up study, because we have lots of mixed materials as well. So impacts of the separation of those mixed materials could definitely be a good question and something to look at in one of the next steps. What we did include, though, was for post-consumer waste, we tried to have a representative amount of waste that is sorted out basically before we start the recycling process for cotton. And of those materials that were sorted out, of course, we also assume that it's just not only material that is damaged or cannot be used, but could also be different materials than cotton. Yeah.
Thank you.
And just a note on that, we will also be covering post-consumer recycled polyester in our forthcoming polyester LCA study as well.
Beth, I'll ask this next question to you. We received a question from Isadora. Is there a plan to create a standard using the LCA criteria?
I think the short answer is no. I'm not sure what's being referenced there. No plans for a standard. But feel free to elaborate on that question if you're thinking about sort of alignment with any other, specific voluntary or regulatory frameworks or anything like that.
Maybe if I can add really quick that Cascade has already aligned with different cotton programs on some sort of like a methodological framework for cotton LCA, and that we were also using this framework to the largest extent possible. I mean, basically they were creating their own model, and we cannot just use their model, but we were following their methodological guideline, and all these methodological decisions were possible. So this already exists, and I think there will be also more alignment coming from now this LCA and the Cascade framework already. So this is already, I think, a good step.
Yeah, no. Thank you for that, Daniel. I think I understand the question a bit better now, or probably the intent of the question. I would also say that across these 7 life cycle assessment studies that Textile Exchange is doing, we're taking learnings in terms of structure and process and so forth in as we go throughout all of those studies. So trying to create, at least some kind of consistency in how we're doing those studies, even though they're being done by different consultants. We're working with different consultants on each of the different topics. So, no plans for a formal standard per se, but I think we're gaining a lot of learnings, I would say, on, how to approach these types of studies and kind of what works and what we need to consider.
Thanks both. That is actually all that we have time for. So I'm really sorry if we didn't get to your questions today. But we have recorded all of them, and if we haven't got to yours, we will reach out to you individually to get your question answered. But yeah, I think I'm gonna bring us to a close now. So just want to say thank you to everyone for joining and for your thoughtful questions, your attention, and your time today. And a huge thank you as well to our lovely speakers. Some questions were asked about this, so just a reminder that there will be a posting of the recording of today's webinar, as well as the slides on the hub, and they'll also be sent to you by email, so you can revisit any part of today's session at any time. Just a quick note that when we close today, you will see a brief Zoom survey appear, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to just share your feedback, as it really is helpful for us to continue improving our sessions. And thank you again for joining. I really hope that you enjoy the session and have a great rest of your day, and see you again soon, I hope.